I used to think my home was my sanctuary, a place where the world stopped at the edge of my property line, and the only rules that mattered were the ones I set for myself. I spent years saving every penny, working double shifts and skipping vacations, all for a single goal: a house with a backyard pool. When I finally signed the closing papers on a beautiful mid-century ranch in a quiet, gated community, I thought I had made it. The pool was perfect: deep blue tiles, a stone waterfall, and a sense of privacy that felt like a luxury I'd finally earned. But I quickly learned that in a neighborhood governed by an HOA, your sanctuary is never truly yours. There is always someone watching, someone measuring the height of your grass, and someone who thinks your hard-earned property is a community asset. In my case, that someone was Margaret, the HOA president, and her 20-year-old son, Tyler. Margaret was the kind of woman who wore her HOA title like a badge of supreme authority. She lived 2 doors down and spent her afternoons patrolling the sidewalks with a clipboard, looking for a reason to exert power. Her son, Tyler, was the physical embodiment of a participation trophy gone wrong. He was a college student who seemed to believe the entire neighborhood was his personal playground. At first, it started small. I'd come home from work and see a wet towel draped over my side fence. Then, I'd notice the water level in the pool was slightly lower than it should be. The realization hit me one Saturday morning when I walked into my kitchen to make coffee and looked out the window. There was Tyler, completely uninvited, doing cannonballs into my pool while 2 of his friends lounged on my expensive outdoor furniture. I walked out there trying to keep my voice steady. I told them they needed to leave immediately. Tyler didn't even look embarrassed. He just wiped the water from his eyes and told me his mom said the pool was part of the original community layout and that the previous owners always let him use it. I explained, as calmly as I could, that I wasn't the previous owner and that for insurance and privacy reasons, I didn't want anyone in my yard when I wasn't home, or ever, unless they were invited. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The next day, I received a formal notice from the HOA, signed by Margaret, claiming that my backyard fence was in violation of the aesthetic code because it was too high and that I was required to keep my side gate unlocked to allow for utility access. The utility access excuse was a blatant lie. My meters were all on the front side of the house. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was trying to force a path open for her son. I ignored the notice and went to the hardware store. I bought the heaviest, most high-tech smart lock I could find. It was a heavy-duty steel bolt that required a fingerprint or a specific code. I installed it that afternoon, feeling a sense of relief as the heavy mechanism clicked into place. I also installed a high-definition 4K camera hidden in the eaves of my roof, aimed directly at the gate and the pool area. If they were going to play games, I needed receipts. For 3 days, it was quiet. Then, on Tuesday afternoon, while I was at my office, my phone started exploding with notifications. My security app was screaming at me. I opened the live feed and my blood ran cold. Tyler was at my gate, kicking it with all his might. When the gate didn't budge, he started screaming. He was throwing a full-blown tantrum, pacing back and forth, calling someone on his phone. A few minutes later, Margaret appeared in the frame. She wasn't trying to calm him down. She was egging him on. She started pulling at the gate, trying to force the lock with a screwdriver she'd brought from her house. When that failed, she pointed at the gate and said something to Tyler. What happened next was something I never could have predicted. Tyler sat down on the ground, leaned his back against my gate, and dialed 911. Through the camera's microphone, I heard him tell the dispatcher that he was being held against his will. He claimed that I had trapped him in a confined space and that he was having a medical emergency. A panic attack brought on by being locked in. It was the most calculated, malicious lie I had ever heard. He wasn't trapped. He was on the outside of the gate trying to get in. But to a dispatcher who couldn't see the scene, it sounded like a kidnapping or a life-threatening situation. I left work immediately, my heart hammering against my ribs. I drove like a maniac, terrified of what the police would find and what Margaret would tell them. As I turned onto my street, the sight was overwhelming. 2 police cruisers and an ambulance were parked in front of my house, their lights painting the neighborhood in rhythmic flashes of red and blue. Neighbors were standing on their porches, whispering and pointing. I pulled into my driveway, jumped out of the car, and was immediately intercepted by an officer who told me to keep my hands where he could see them. Margaret was center stage, wailing like a professional mourner. She was telling the other officer that I was a dangerous, unstable individual who had installed illegal traps on my property to hurt her son. Tyler was sitting in the back of the ambulance, a blanket draped over his shoulders, breathing into a paper bag and acting like he'd just escaped a war zone. The officer who approached me was stern. He told me they had a report of a person being unlawfully detained and a booby-trapped gate. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I simply pulled out my phone, opened the security app, and handed it to him. I told him to start the recording from 10 minutes before the 911 call. We stood there in the middle of my driveway, the officer, 2 EMTs, and a few curious neighbors who had drifted closer. The video was crystal clear. It showed Tyler approaching the gate, trying to break the lock, and then Margaret joining him with the screwdriver. It showed them realizing they couldn't get in, and then it showed the moment Tyler sat down and calmly dialed 911. His voice on the recording sounding panicked and frail while his face on the screen looked bored and annoyed. The officer's expression shifted from suspicion to cold, hard realization. He looked at the screen, then at Tyler, then at Margaret, who had gone suddenly silent. The officer asked me if I wanted to press charges for trespassing and attempted breaking and entering. I looked at Margaret, whose face was now a pale shade of gray. The power she had spent years building in this neighborhood was evaporating in real time. But I didn't stop there. I told the officer I also wanted to report a false 911 call and filing a false police report. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The EMTs, realizing they had been called out for a fake panic attack while real emergencies might be happening elsewhere, looked disgusted. They packed up their gear and left without a word to Tyler. The police didn't play around. They escorted Tyler out of the ambulance and informed him he was being detained for questioning regarding the misuse of the emergency system. Margaret started screaming about her rights and her position on the board, but the officer just told her that if she didn't step back, she'd be facing an interference charge as well. Watching Tyler being led toward the patrol car was one of the most surreal moments of my life. The neighborhood bully, the kid who thought my property was his, was finally facing the reality that the world doesn't belong to him just because his mother has a clipboard. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was massive. I didn't just let the police handle it. I took the footage to the rest of the HOA board. When the other members saw their president trying to break into a neighbor's yard with a screwdriver, the vote to remove her was unanimous. She was stripped of her title, and the community, long tired of her tyranny, turned their backs on her. Tyler ended up with a hefty fine and a significant amount of community service for the false 911 call, a mark on his record that won't be easy to explain away. But the real victory wasn't the legal stuff. It was the first time I went back into my pool after everything settled. The water was cool, the sun was setting, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was being watched. I sat on the edge of the water, looking at that heavy steel lock on the gate, and I realized that a home isn't just about the walls or the pool or the grass. It's about the boundaries we set and the courage we have to defend them. Margaret and Tyler thought they could take whatever they wanted because they felt entitled to the fruits of my labor. They thought a badge of local authority was a license to ignore the law. They were wrong. Now, when I walk through my neighborhood, people actually wave. The air feels lighter. Margaret's house is currently for sale. She couldn't handle the shame of being the neighborhood pariah. As for me, I still have that smart lock and I still check my cameras. But mostly, I just enjoy the silence. I learned that sometimes you have to stand your ground and endure the storm to finally get the peace you paid for. My backyard is finally mine again, and every time I hear that gate lock click into place, I'm reminded that some things are worth protecting at all costs. The blue tiles of my pool shimmer in the light, no longer a community asset, but a private reward for a battle well fought. I realize that entitlement only has as much power as you allow it to have, and once you draw a line in the sand, or in my case, a lock on a gate, the world eventually learns to respect it. I found my sanctuary, and this time, I'm keeping the key. Would you like me to write a follow-up story about what happened during the intense HOA meeting where Margaret tried to defend her actions before being ousted?